So, when you hear the term medieval India, what really comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's just this thousand-year blur of kings and battles, but it was so much more than that. This was an era of radical transformation that didn't just redraw the map, it actually reshaped the soul of the subcontinent. Let's dig into that story of transformation together. There is this common idea that this was India's dark age, some kind of stagnant period stuck between ancient glory and modern progress. But was it really? Or was it actually a profoundly dynamic era? Full of conflict, sure, but also absolutely brimming with innovation and incredible cultural fusion. That's the big question we're tackling today. Okay, to get our bearings, let's just quickly break down this millennium. First up, we've got the early medieval period, which was all about powerful, competing regional kingdoms. Then, boom, the Delhi Sultanate arrives and forges a new, centralized empire. And finally, we get the Mughal Empire, an era famous for its sheer grandeur. We're going to be looking at the big shifts across all three of these periods. Right, so let's start at the top, with power. How exactly did rulers go from being regional warlords to emperors controlling these massive territories? Well, it was all about evolving the imperial blueprint. Before any single empire could really take hold, India was kind of like a patchwork quilt of powerful kingdoms. The North, in particular, was locked in what historians called the tripartite struggle, a relentless three-way tug-of-war between the Pratiharas, the Palas, and the Rashtrakutas. This constant fighting just completely drained their resources, which left a huge power vacuum that new forces from the Northwest were more than ready to fill. Now, this is where things get really interesting. You see this huge shift in why invaders were coming from Central Asia. Early on, you had figures like Mahmud of Ghazni. They were basically raiders. Their goal was loot, plain and simple. They wanted to plunder wealth from India to pay for their armies and ambitions back home. But the dynasties that came later, like the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals, had a totally different endgame. They weren't there for a smash and grab. They were looking for a homeland. Their goal was to settle down, to rule, and to build a lasting empire in India. It's a fundamental shift from just taking things to actually building things. Which, of course, brings us to a huge question. Once you decide you're going to build an empire, how do you actually control it? I mean, we're talking about a time with no phones, no internet, no modern bureaucracy. How do you possibly collect taxes and raise a giant army from this vast, incredibly diverse population? Well, they came up with a pretty ingenious solution, the Iqta System. Here's how it worked. The Sultan would grant chunks of land called Iqtas to his nobles. In return, those nobles had two main jobs: collect taxes from that land and, this is the crucial part, use some of that money to maintain a private army of soldiers ready to fight for the Sultan whenever he called. It was this brilliant, decentralized way to handle military and financial control, and it became the absolute backbone of the Sultanate. Okay, so that's the view from the throne room. But what was life like for everybody else? For that, we need to shift our focus from the palaces to the streets and villages. And we can get an amazing glimpse of that through the eyes of one very remarkable traveler. Let me introduce you to Al-Biruni. He was a Persian scholar who traveled to India way back in the 11th century, learned Sanskrit, and wrote this incredibly detailed account of the society he saw. And this quote from him, wow. It really captures this sense of immense pride and maybe just a little bit of isolation in the Indian society of his day. Now, Al-Biruni's analysis was sharp and, to be honest, not always flattering. He noticed that the caste system had become incredibly rigid, splitting into more than 1,000 subgroups called jatis. These were basically super tight-knit communities based on your job and social standing. He also saw a worrying drop in scientific innovation. He felt that compared to the earlier Gupta period, which was a real golden age for Indian science, people were now leaning way more on tradition and faith than on rational inquiry. The big picture he painted was of a society that, while very proud, was also becoming a bit static and starting to fall behind regions like his home, Persia. And this really shows you the harsh reality for the average person. The endless wars among the elites created this absolutely devastating cycle. First, the wars would drain the treasury. So to pay for them, rulers would crank up the taxes on farmers. Pushed to their absolute limit, farmers would often just abandon their land, which then led directly to food shortages and widespread famine. For so many people, life was just a precarious balancing act of survival. But it wasn't all just conflict and hardship. Not at all. This period also saw an incredible fusion of cultures.
It gave rise to brand new ideas, new forms of art, and whole new ways of thinking about God.
And it is so important to understand that this cultural exchange was not a one-way street. It was a vibrant, two-way flow of ideas. You had this foundational Indian knowledge traveling west into the Arab world, while at the same time, Persian and Central Asian culture, art, and ways of governing were flowing east into India.
And this exchange had a truly global impact. Think about it. The decimal system, an Indian invention, was transmitted to Europe through Arab mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi. I mean, that literally changed the course of science forever. At the same time, Persian administrative techniques and artistic styles became the language of power and beauty in the courts of India, creating this unique and beautiful Indo-Persian culture. And you can see this beautiful synthesis most clearly in religion. Two hugely popular movements, the Hindu Bhakti movement and Islamic Sufism, popped up and really flourished. And just look at the parallels. Both were all about a personal, emotional devotion to God. Both rejected complicated rituals and rigid social structures like the caste system. You even had figures like Kabir, who preached this powerful message of unity, drawing from both traditions. This was a spiritual revolution happening from the ground up. So after all that, why does this history really matter today? Because the legacy of this 1,000-year period is literally all around us. It forged the very foundations of the modern subcontinent.
The blueprint for a centralized state laid the groundwork for future empires, including the one the British would later take over. The unique Indo-Islamic culture, you can see it in everything from the Taj Mahal to the words we speak every day. Those popular religious movements challenge the old guard and still influence how people practice their faith today. This era created the incredibly complex social fabric that the first Europeans would encounter and then exploit. This isn't just ancient history. It's practically the operating system of the modern subcontinent. So, far from being a dark age, medieval India was this intense, transformative, and absolutely foundational period. Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. How do 1,000 years of empire, conflict, and cultural fusion still echo in the politics, the society, and the identity of our world today?